It didn't need her name. It never does. That's how Trump plays the game. He tosses a grenade and lets the crowd figure out who it was meant for. The post came late, as they always do, like he wanted it to fester overnight, to sink in before the morning news could even catch up. A swipe disguised as commentary, a jab dressed in the usual smugness. A loudmouth Democrat from Texas who should learn her place. 7 words, carefully picked to sound like politics but smell like a warning. And people knew. You could feel the air shift the moment it dropped. It wasn't vague, it was intentional. The kind of statement that isn't meant to debate, just dominate. Meant to signal to his base that he still holds the mic, still controls the spotlight, still knows how to make someone flinch without ever calling them by name. But this time, the play landed differently. Because the woman on the receiving end wasn't afraid of noise. Jasmine Crockett has heard worse, lived worse, and she's never waited for anyone's permission to speak. Trump thought he was dealing with another name he could throw around like a prop. But what he forgot, what he always forgets, is that some people have already survived the storm. They don't fear the thunder anymore. This wasn't just a line in a post, it was a spark. And Crockett, she didn't fan it, she turned it into a fire. Because while Trump was busy casting shadows, she was walking into the light, mic in hand, story in heart, truth on her tongue. What he framed as an insult, she turned into a rallying cry. What he thought would humiliate her, only elevated her. And that's where the twist begins. The man who built his image on strength tried to flex it, and ended up exposing his weakness. He underestimated her, and the country watched it backfire, frame by frame. And that was the mistake. Because while Trump's team thought they were dealing with another politician who might fold, who might fire off a weak statement and wait for the news cycle to move on, they weren't. They were dealing with someone who's walked through fire barefoot and learned how to make that pain her fuel. And when Crockett went public, she didn't just respond, she unleashed. And that was the mistake. The one miscalculation that always seems small at first, right until it explodes. Trump's team assumed they were playing the same old game. Toss out the insult, rattle the cage, let the headlines swirl, and watch the target backpedal into safe statements crafted by nervous aides. That's the rhythm they were used to. They'd done it 100 times. They thought Jasmine Crockett would fold under the weight of the spotlight, maybe post a carefully worded response, maybe hold a press conference dripping with cautious language, waiting for the storm to pass. They were ready for her to play defense. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't built for defense. They weren't dealing with another politician afraid to lose donors or tiptoe through controversy. They were dealing with someone who had walked through hell long before she ever walked into Congress. Someone who had learned to stand tall when her legs were shaking. Someone who knew what it meant to fight for a seat at the table when the door was never meant to open for her in the first place. Jasmine wasn't rattled by pressure, she was shaped by it. Trump tried to throw gasoline. Jasmine lit the match. When she went public, she didn't come out swinging wildly. She came out surgical. She didn't just respond, she dismantled. Line by line, truth for every lie, calm for every insult. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She only needed one sentence at a time to cut through the noise. Every word landed with weight, not because they were rehearsed, but because they came from a place far deeper than politics. They came from lived experience, from every time she was underestimated, disrespected, or told to wait her turn. And as she spoke, the ground beneath Trump shifted. What was supposed to be just another night of attention-grabbing chaos had suddenly become a moment he couldn't control. The headlines weren't about his post anymore. They were about her voice. The room had flipped, the power dynamic reversed. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just fire back. She unleashed a storm that no one saw coming, and once it started, there was no putting it back in the bottle. At her next appearance, everything about the moment shifted. The cameras were rolling, the mics were hot, but Jasmine Crockett didn't approach that podium like someone stepping into a fight. She walked up like someone stepping into her place. The room was packed. Press, politicians, supporters, skeptics, but she didn't scan the crowd, didn't search for faces of approval. She locked eyes with no one and everyone at once. The podium wasn't her armor, it was her amplifier. She didn't hide behind it, she owned it. When she started speaking, her voice didn't tremble, it didn't rise, it didn't rush. It simply existed, steady, sharp, deliberate. Every word was measured, but behind the calm was something heavier. You could hear it underneath the surface, like distant thunder right before a storm breaks open. The kind of thunder you don't hear as much as you feel in your chest. She wasn't there to score points. She was there to shift the ground beneath their feet. When a man with a platform built on fear tries to silence a woman built on truth, she said. The words didn't come out like a political zinger or a headline grab. They came out like a sentence she'd rehearsed in her head 1,000 times without ever needing to write it down. Because it wasn't new. It was old. Older than this moment. Older than Trump. It was every room, every table, every job interview, every debate stage where power had tried to shrink her voice. He better be ready for what comes next. The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't need to. The silence was thicker than any applause could have been. Because those listening knew what they had just heard wasn't a performance. It was a warning. A line drawn, a fuse lit. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if they too recognized that something real had just been placed on record. No one dared interrupt. Even the people in the back who had come to oppose her, the ones who wanted her rattled, sat frozen. Because in that moment, they weren't witnessing a politician fighting for survival. They were witnessing someone stepping fully into her power, someone who refused to be small, someone who had been told her whole life to lower her voice, and had finally decided to raise it louder than the system that told her to whisper. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration that this fight wouldn't be one Trump could control, and it was a message to everyone watching, whether in that room or from a screen across the country. The rules of this game had just changed, permanently. She didn't lead with his name. She didn't give him that power. She started with something stronger, her own story, the part of the story that too many people overlook because they don't want to face it. She reached back to where it all began, to South Oak Cliff, where the sidewalks cracked but the people stood tall, where survival wasn't theory, it was practice. She spoke of growing up a black girl in a world that measured her worth before she even had a chance to prove it. Before she opened her mouth, they had already made up their minds about who she was, what she could be, and how far she was allowed to go. But she didn't shrink under that weight. She carried it. She learned how to turn every sideways glance, every condescending tone, every locked door into fuel. When they told her she was too young, too loud, too angry, she kept stepping forward. Every time someone tried to dismiss her, they were unknowingly sharpening her edge. They thought they were cutting her down. They were building her armor. I was underestimated before I even opened my mouth, she said, her voice steady but heavy with every moment that sentence carried. She let the pause hang, like she wanted everyone to feel the weight of what she was really saying. But that didn't stop me. It built me. And in that instant, the whole tone shifted. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was personal. It wasn't a back-and-forth debate with sound bites traded like punches. This was lived experience stepping into the ring. This was every room she'd been told she didn't belong in flashing behind her eyes. And now, standing on that stage, she wasn't asking for permission to speak. She was taking it. Trump wanted to rattle her. He wanted to remind her where he thought she belonged. But Jasmine Crockett was standing exactly where she belonged, not because someone allowed her to be there, but because she forced her way into a system designed to keep her out. And the more she spoke, the more it became clear. This fight was bigger than him. It always was. Then she turned directly into the storm. She didn't flinch, didn't soften her tone, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing even a crack. She didn't stand there as someone who had been threatened. She stood there as someone who had been challenged and was ready to answer. The air in the room thickened, like everyone instinctively knew this was the moment the balance shifted. "You don't scare me," she said, and it wasn't loud. It was sharper than that. Sharper because it was true. Sharper because it was earned. She wasn't speaking for applause. She was speaking for everyone who's been pushed into silence by people who think power gives them the right to intimidate. She was staring straight into the camera, but her words were cutting through every screen, every living room, every office, speaking to people who've been on the receiving end of that same kind of power for far too long. You don't get to throw your weight around and expect the rest of us to cower. The words hung like heavy smoke, impossible to wave away. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't hoping for understanding. She was drawing a line, and she was daring anyone to try and cross it. This wasn't defiance for show. It was survival turned into strength. A kind of strength that comes from years of being underestimated and learning exactly how to stand when someone bigger tries to make you small. That might have worked before, but I'm not built like that. She leaned in, letting every syllable hit with precision. She wanted him to hear it. She wanted the country to hear it. She wanted the system to hear it, and she made sure no one could mistake the message. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every voice that had been muted, every career threatened, every person who's ever been told to know their place. And I'm not alone. The second those words left her mouth, the room shifted again. Because she wasn't. Behind her were millions who saw themselves in her fight. People who had never stood at a podium, but who knew what it felt like to be cornered, belittled, silenced. People who finally had someone saying what they've been screaming inside their heads for years. And with that, Trump's threat didn't just backfire, it detonated into something far more dangerous for him, a movement he couldn't control. Suddenly, it wasn't about Trump's words anymore. His insult was just the spark. The fire spreading now was much bigger, much older. The focus shifted to something that's lived in the cracks of every system for generations, a pattern so familiar that people almost stopped seeing it. But Jasmine Crockett dragged it into the light. This wasn't a one-off attack. This was how power works when it feels threatened. This was the playbook. Men with platforms using volume and venom to shrink women who dare to speak, to drown them out with laughter, with nicknames, with carefully packaged mockery dressed up as politics. It's how they twist strength into arrogance, how they call confidence attitude, how they applaud aggression in men but label it emotional when it comes from women, how they pretend every attack is just a joke, and if you call it out, you're accused of overreacting. And Jasmine knew that game by heart. The tweets weren't just posts, they were weapons, crafted to trigger headlines, to stir up his base, to plant seeds of doubt. And every time a woman like Jasmine stepped forward, they fired those same shots, expecting her to flinch, to shrink, to either stay quiet or play nice. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing nice. She wasn't playing at all. She stood there and dismantled the whole tactic for what it was. Not debate, but domination. Not policy, but power games. Not leadership, but bullying hiding behind microphones and followers. She exposed the double standard that punishes women for being strong and rewards men for being ruthless. She showed everyone watching that this wasn't about her feelings being hurt. It was about power trying to crush accountability before it ever had to face it. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't having any of it. She wasn't bending to protect anyone's comfort. She wasn't diluting the truth to make it easier to swallow. She was holding it up, raw and heavy, daring them to look away. And for once, they couldn't. She came armed with more than words. She came with receipts. Cold, sharp, undeniable. The kind of facts that don't flinch under pressure. She didn't need to raise her voice or drown anyone out because the truth, when laid bare, does the heavy lifting all on its own. She flipped through her notes like a surgeon picking up the right tool for each cut. Every quote, every date, every number was a blade aimed directly at the hollow space behind Trump's bluster. "You called me a disgrace to Congress," she said, her voice steady, like she was reading a statement already written in history. "But you're the one who incited a mob to attack the Capitol." The air in the room tightened. She didn't blink. She kept going, layer by layer, pulling back the mask he hides behind. "You talk about law and order," she continued, while ducking indictments. The words hit like punches, but they weren't wild swings. They were precise shots to the ribs, designed to leave him gasping for narrative control. She wasn't just talking to Trump anymore. She was talking to everyone watching, forcing them to see the cracks behind the image, to hear the weight behind the headlines they've grown numb to. "You brag about being tough while hiding behind your followers like a coward with a bullhorn." That one landed hardest. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Because everyone knew exactly what she meant. The threats, the rallies, the cryptic posts, where he lets others carry out the ugliest parts while he stands back and smiles, pretending his hands are clean. She exposed it all without shouting, without grandstanding, just one line after another, each one peeling back the performance, revealing the cowardice underneath. And as the words sank in, it became clear. This wasn't just a clash, it was a reckoning. There was no screaming, no finger-pointing, no dramatic pauses designed for sound bites. Just a sharp, surgical takedown that left no room for twisting her words. Precision, clean and devastating. Every sentence was delivered like she was laying bricks, building something solid that couldn't be knocked down. And long before the political spin machines even got warmed up, the internet had already taken it and run. The clip spread like fire. Before her own staff even had a chance to upload the official version, millions had already watched shaky cell phone footage, shared by people who just happened to be in the room. TikTok lit up instantly, not with random noise, but with people who felt every word in their bones. Women, black women, young activists, survivors of harassment, people who've sat in rooms where they were told to be quiet, all stitching themselves into her speech. One after another, eyes locked on the camera, sharing their own moments when they were silenced, mocked, or dismissed, but kept standing anyway. Twitter exploded like it hadn't in months. It wasn't just politics now, it was personal. Hashtags stormed every trending chart. Yeah, Crockett Clapback. Yeah, not backing down. Yeah, truth over tyrants. People who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before that night suddenly felt like she was speaking directly for them, like someone had finally said the thing they've been waiting years to hear in a place where it could no longer be ignored. And as the views climbed into the millions, it wasn't about Trump's threat anymore. It was about the wave she had unleashed. A wave of people who finally saw someone stand at that microphone and refuse to shrink, refuse to play polite, refused to accept intimidation as the price of speaking the truth. Meanwhile, Trump's team was spinning in circles behind the scenes. The threat hadn't landed like they expected. It had backfired, loud and fast. So they did what they always do, scrambled to regain control of the narrative before it slipped too far. They rushed out a carefully worded, painfully hollow statement filled with their usual buzzwords: free speech, political theater, liberal sensitivity. A clumsy attempt to pivot, to paint Jasmine as the one overreacting. They wanted to make it sound like just another moment of media hysteria, another woman who couldn't take a joke. But this time, the public wasn't buying it. The comment sections exploded, and not in their favor. People weren't fooled by the deflection. Every sentence of that statement got shredded in real time. Underneath every official post, the same message kept echoing. She brought facts. You brought fear. She stood alone. You stood behind a screen. The crowd saw through the playbook. They saw a man who couldn't face her directly, couldn't argue the facts, couldn't match her composure, and every weak excuse Trump's team tried to float only made it worse. The more they talked, the clearer it became. Jasmine Crockett had taken the shot meant to silence her and turned it into a mirror, one that reflected everything they didn't want America to see. And America was watching. What Trump had underestimated, again, was something his entire playbook never accounted for: the power of someone who has nothing left to prove. He mistook her calm for weakness. He thought a late-night jab dripping with arrogance would be enough to knock her off balance, to send her scrambling into damage control like so many before her. But this time, the script broke. He assumed the threat would corner her. Instead, it gave her a stage. He thought she'd flinch, stumble, second-guess herself under the weight of his following. Instead, she stood taller, steadier, sharper. He thought he could reduce her to a headline and move on, but with every attempt to diminish her, he only made her story louder. What was meant to shrink her voice turned into a microphone that carried her words farther than any press conference ever could. He didn't just fail to silence her, he handed her momentum. He handed her millions of people who saw themselves in her strength. He thought one post could erase her presence. Instead, that post marked the exact moment her platform grew beyond his control. And in trying to bury her, Trump did what he feared most. He built her. Back in her office that night, there was no celebration, no champagne, no cheering staff posting selfies. The buzz outside didn't follow her inside. The noise of the internet stayed at the door. Inside, it was quiet, steady, focused, just like always. Her team sat around tables, still reviewing drafts, still fine-tuning the next bill, still chasing the policies that don't trend but actually change lives. The clip was everywhere, millions of views, headlines stacking up. But in that room, none of it mattered more than the work. When one of her aides glanced at their phone and said softly, "We just hit 5 million," Crockett barely looked up. She paused her pen for half a second, then went right back to reviewing her notes. "Good," she said calmly, "but the housing crisis is still here. Let's get back to it." Because that's who she is. Not a headline, not a meme, not a one-night flash on the trending page. She isn't in this for viral clips or internet trophies. She's in it for the people who never get a camera pointed at them, for the stories that don't go viral, for the fights that don't fit neatly into 60-second sound bites, the ones who need the work done long after the cameras stop rolling. Jasmine Crockett is not a moment. She's a mission. And that's what makes her dangerous to people like Trump. Because the storm may pass, but she'll still be standing, doing the work. And that's why the threat blew up in his face. Not just because she clapped back, not just because she held her ground, but but because she turned the whole moment into a mirror and made every person watching see themselves standing there. She reminded them, without shouting, without theatrics, that you don't need permission to speak truth to power. You don't need a title or a stage to call out the ones who think they sit above accountability. You don't need fear to fight fire, because when someone tries to silence you with a smirk, a sneer, a tweet meant to humiliate, you don't shrink. You don't stumble. You don't whisper. You answer. You answer with your story, your facts, your voice sharpened by every room you were never supposed to walk into. And you say the words they never saw coming. That's what Jasmine Crockett did. She didn't just respond. She flipped the script they've been using for years and rewrote the playbook right in front of them. She didn't just survive the moment. She owned it, expanded it, and turned it into something that outlived every headline. And long after the cameras move on, long after the hashtags fade, that echo of her standing there unshaken is still ringing. Louder, stronger. Carried now by the voices she lit on fire,